I will pay when I grow up. I swear, ma'am. The 10-year-old's voice cracked as she clutched the baby formula against her chest like it was worth more than gold. Her hand was shaking so badly the carton nearly slipped from her frozen fingers. The cashier looked down at her empty pockets, then at the little girl's desperate eyes, and her face softened with pity she couldn't hide. But before anyone could say another word, the store doors slammed open. "Nyla, what do you think you're doing?" The voice was cold, dangerous, and the way that little girl froze. Her whole body went rigid like she'd just heard death itself call her name. A man stood by the lottery counter, watching this scene unfold. At first glance, he looked like just another customer in a gray beanie and worn jacket. But something about the little girl's words had stopped him cold. At first, he thought maybe she was playing some game. Kids do that, right? Pretend shopping, make-believe promises. But then he saw her face. That wasn't pretend. That was a child who understood hunger in ways no child ever should. That was a 10-year-old making deals with a future she couldn't even imagine because her baby brother hadn't eaten since morning. And when that man walked through those doors, when a stranger saw the way she flinched, the way her breath stopped, the way her eyes went wide with pure terror, he knew exactly what kind of man had just entered. The kind who rules with fists. The kind who breaks spirits before bones. The kind who makes children afraid to breathe too loudly. The milk hit the floor. White liquid spread across the tiles like innocence shattering into 1,000 pieces. And in that moment, standing in that grocery store on the coldest night of winter, the stranger had to make a choice. Walk away like everyone else always does. Or step between that little girl and the nightmare that came for her. He hadn't saved anyone in 3 years. Not since the night he lost everything that mattered. Not since the fire took his wife and daughter while he stood outside, helpless, listening to screams he couldn't reach. But tonight, he wasn't walking away. "Let her go," he said, and everything changed. What happened next would test every ounce of courage that little girl didn't know she had. It would force a mother to choose between fear and love. It would turn one desperate promise into a fight for survival that would last until dawn. Because some promises aren't about money. They're about what you're willing to sacrifice when everything is on the line. This is the story of how one little girl's promise to pay changed 3 lives forever. And you need to hear every single word. Before we dive into this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And if you're watching this without subscribing, you're making the same mistake people make every day. Assuming you'll catch the important parts later, assuming the story will wait for you. But it won't. So subscribe now before this story twists again and you're left behind wondering what you missed. The snow didn't fall gently that night. It slammed against the pavement like tiny shards of broken glass, sharp enough to sting any exposed skin, unforgiving enough to remind 10-year-old Nyla Rivers that the world owed her nothing. She pressed her small, trembling palms against the cold glass door of Broadway Fresh Mart, her breath fogging the window in desperate little clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Inside, the lights glowed warm and yellow, casting a soft halo over rows of food she could never afford, creating a world that felt as distant as the moon. Hunger wasn't a stranger to Nyla. It had been her shadow for months now, following her through every cold morning and sleepless night. But tonight, something felt different. Something felt crueler because tonight wasn't just about her empty stomach. Her baby brother Zion hadn't eaten since morning, and babies don't understand words like wait, or maybe tomorrow, or we have no money. Babies only understand the gnawing ache in their tiny bellies and the desperate need for warmth. Nyla's fingers tightened around a half-empty plastic juice bottle she'd fished out of a trash bin earlier that evening. The liquid inside barely enough to fill a shot glass, nowhere near enough to quiet Zion's cries. She knew what she had to do, even if every instinct screamed that it was hopeless, even if shame already burned hot in her chest. The automatic doors whooshed open as she stepped inside, and the sudden warmth wrapped around her like an embrace she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. People turned to stare, not with kindness, not with concern, but but with that particular type of stare that said, "You don't belong here. You're from the wrong side of everything." Her clothes hung thin and threadbare on her small frame. Her boots were 3 sizes too big and stuffed with newspaper to keep them from slipping off, and her scarf had come from a church donation box 2 winters ago, frayed at the edges and smelling faintly of mothballs and someone else's memories. Nyla kept her head down and walked straight to the dairy aisle, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it echoing through the store. She reached up with shaking fingers and lifted a cold carton of baby milk formula from the shelf, holding it against her chest like it was made of pure gold, like it was the most precious thing in the entire world, because to her, in that moment, absolutely was. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the carton tighter, and somewhere deep in her mind, she already knew how this would end. She knew the cashier wouldn't let her walk out with it, knew that security might be called, knew that shame would follow her out into the cold night like another shadow she couldn't shake. But she also knew that Zion's cries had grown weaker over the past few hours, that his tiny fists had stopped clenching with the same strength, that her mother's exhausted face had looked more defeated than ever. So Nyla walked to the counter anyway, her legs feeling like they might give out at any second, her throat tight with unshed tears. The cashier, a tall woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Gloria, looked down at the carton, then at Nyla's empty, trembling hands, then back at the carton again. "Sweetheart," Gloria said softly, her voice carrying both pity and resignation. "Where's your money?" Nyla swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak, making the words come out small and broken. I don't have any right now, but I'll pay when I grow up. I swear on everything. I promise I will." Her voice cracked, not from fear, though fear was definitely there, coiling in her stomach like a snake, but from the overwhelming shame of being 10 years old and already making impossible deals with a future she couldn't even imagine. A man standing by the lottery counter turned slowly, his eyes dragging toward her like her words had physically pulled something broken loose inside him. He wasn't dressed like the wealth everyone whispered about when they saw him on rare occasions. Not tonight, anyway. Tonight he wore just a faded gray beanie pulled low over his forehead, a scruffy jacket that had seen better days, and boots covered in brown slush from the streets outside. But this was Silas Bradford, the quiet billionaire who rarely let the world see him anymore. Not since the night tragedy had ripped through his life like wildfire 3 winters ago, taking everything that mattered and leaving him hollowed out and silent. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and careful, like he was approaching something fragile that might shatter if he moved too fast. The cashier sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of a decision she'd made 100 times before. "Sweetheart, it doesn't work like..." But before Gloria could finish, before the words could crush what little hope Nyla had left, Silas interrupted. "I'll pay," he said, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of pain so deep it made the air around them feel heavier. It was the kind of pain adults try to hide, the kind that only children who'd lived through their own nightmares could recognize instantly. Nyla looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with confusion and caution, trying to understand why a stranger would help her, trying to figure out if this was real or just another cruel joke the universe was playing. But before she could find her voice, before she could even begin to process what was happening, the automatic doors slid open with a violent whoosh that made everyone in the store flinch. A voice, cold, sharp, and dripping with barely controlled rage, echoed from the entrance, cutting through the warm air like a blade made of ice. "Nyla," the voice said, each syllable deliberate and threatening. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She froze completely, every muscle in her small body locking up as terror flooded through her veins. The milk carton trembled violently in her hands, threatening to slip from her grip. Because that voice belonged to Rex, her mother's boyfriend, the man who controlled their lives with fists that left bruises and words that left scars, the man who ruled their tiny apartment with fear and violence. The air in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees, and Silas Bradford noticed everything. The way Nyla's breathing stopped, the way her shoulders hunched protectively, the way her eyes went wide with a terror no child should ever know. He noticed everything, and something ancient and protective stirred inside him, something he thought had died in the flames 3 years ago. Nyla turned slowly, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete. Rex stood under the store's buzzing fluorescent lights, his face half-shadowed by a black hood pulled low, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. His eyes, always bloodshot, always unpredictable, always dangerous, locked onto the milk carton in her trembling hands like a predator spotting wounded prey. "You stealing now?" he growled, his voice low and venomous, each word dripping with the kind of anger that had left bruises on her mother's arms and fear embedded in every corner of their apartment. "That what you want? You want her mama to get arrested for raising a thief?" Nyla shook her head so fast her vision blurred, panic rising in her throat like bile. I wasn't stealing. I was just..." But before she could finish, before she could explain about Zion's cries or the promise she'd made or the stranger who'd offered to help, Rex moved with terrifying speed and grabbed her wrist so suddenly, so violently, that the milk carton flew from her hands and exploded against the tile floor. White liquid spread across the polished surface like spilled innocence, like hope shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The cashier gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. A couple shopping nearby took several quick steps backward, their eyes wide, but their bodies frozen, unwilling to get involved in something that looked like it could turn ugly fast. In Silas Bradford's eyes, those quiet, observant eyes that had seen too much pain in his own life, darkened with something dangerous, something protective, something that hadn't stirred in him since the night he'd lost everything. Rex leaned down, close to Nyla's face, so close she could smell the alcohol on his breath, mixing with cigarette smoke and rage. "I told you not to embarrass me again, didn't I?" His grip tightened around her thin wrist, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks that would turn purple by morning. "Didn't I tell you to stay home and keep your mouth shut?" Nyla whimpered, a small sound of pain and terror that cut through the store's artificial warmth like a knife. And that sound, that tiny, broken sound from a child in pain, broke something loose inside Silas Bradford. He stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that made everyone in the store turn to look. "Let her go." Rex's head snapped up, irritation flashing across his features as he sized up this stranger in the gray beanie and scruffy jacket. "Mind your business, man. She's family." The word family came out twisted, like he was claiming ownership rather than love. Silas didn't blink, didn't back down, didn't show even a flicker of fear. "She's a child, and you're a stranger who needs to stay in his lane." Rex shot back, his grip on Nyla's wrist tightening even more, making her bite her lip to keep from crying out. Silas's voice dropped lower, colder, more dangerous than Rex had anticipated. "And yet I'm the only one here who seems concerned about her safety." Rex let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded more like a bark. "You got no idea who you're talking to, old man." "That makes both of us," Silas replied evenly, his gaze sharpening into something that made Rex pause for just a fraction of a second. Rex studied him carefully, really looked at him for the first time, trying to gauge whether this scruffy stranger was actually a threat or just another bleeding heart who'd back down the moment things got serious. He had absolutely no idea that the man standing in front of him owned half the buildings on this block, that his quiet appearance hid a fortune most people couldn't comprehend. That wealth and power were things Silas Bradford wore invisibly because he'd learned long ago that money couldn't save the people who mattered most. Nyla's voice came out small and trembling, barely more than a whisper. "Please, Zion is crying at home. He needs food. He's just a baby." Something in her voice, the desperation, the exhaustion, the weight of responsibility no 10-year-old should carry, made Silas kneel beside her without hesitation, without asking permission, without caring what Rex thought. "I'll get you a new one," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with a gentleness that felt foreign in her world of violence and fear. "Stay right here." Rex's hand shot out, grabbing Silas's shoulder. "No, you won't. We're leaving. Now." Silas stood slowly, deliberately, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire store, that made even the cashier stop breathing for a moment. No, she is not leaving with you like this. For a heartbeat, maybe two, the entire world seemed to pause. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the back of the store, a refrigerator compressor kicked on. Nyla's heart pounded so loudly in her chest, she felt dizzy, felt like the floor might open up and swallow her whole. Rex clenched his fist, knuckles white, jaw working as he processed this unexpected resistance. Who the hell are you supposed to be? Silas stood his ground, his body language relaxed but his eyes hard as steel. Someone who doesn't like bullies. The cashier whispered urgently into her walkie-talkie, her voice shaky. Manager to the front. Now, we need security. Nyla tugged gently on Silas's jacket sleeve, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond this moment, a fear built from years of watching what happened when Rex got angry. Please don't make him mad. You don't know what he does when he gets mad. Silas looked down at her, and something inside his chest cracked open, something old and painful and buried, something he'd locked away the night he'd stood outside his burning house 3 years ago, listening to screams he couldn't reach, watching flames consume the only two people he'd ever truly loved. He saw Nyla trembling, saw the fading bruise on her jawline that makeup couldn't quite hide, saw the desperation in her eyes that came from growing up too fast in a world that showed no mercy. And suddenly, without warning, he wasn't standing in a grocery store anymore. He was back in that burning hallway, hearing his daughter's voice screaming for help that never came, feeling the heat that had kept him from reaching her, living through the worst moment of his life all over again. Rex took a step toward Nyla, his intention clear. Silas moved faster, positioning himself directly between the man and the child, his body a wall of quiet determination. Touch her again, Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow more threatening than any shout could be, and I promise you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Rex smirked, but there was something uncertain flickering behind his bravado now, something that recognized danger even when it came wrapped in a scruffy jacket and gray beanie. Yeah? Says who? Silas didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, didn't want to. Says the man who's not letting her leave with you tonight. Nyla looked up at him with eyes that held something she'd stopped believing in months ago. Hope. Real, fragile, terrifying hope. And that hope scared her more than Rex's fists ever could, because hope was dangerous when you'd learned that losing it hurt worse than never having it all. If you are not subscribed, tell me why you're choosing to stand outside this story instead of joining us, because what happens next will separate the casual viewers from the ones who stay until the final truth is revealed. Rex stormed out of the store, his boots leaving angry, wet tracks across the tile floor, muttering curses under his breath that made the remaining customers look away in uncomfortable silence. But Silas knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. Men like Rex never walked away. They circled back like wolves. They waited in shadows. They watched for weakness and struck when you thought you were finally safe. Nyla stared at the spilled milk spreading across the floor, her whole body still shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, and whispered so quietly Silas almost didn't hear her. He's going to be so mad. He gets really, really mad when things don't go his way. Silas crouched down to her level again, his knees creaking slightly, and when he spoke his voice carried the gentleness of someone who understood what it meant to be terrified. Where's your mother right now? Nyla's lips pressed together in a tight line. A small act of protection, loyalty, fear all mixed into one gesture that broke his heart, because children shouldn't have to protect their parents from the truth. She's at home. She's tired. The word tired hung in the air between them, and Silas heard everything she wasn't saying. Tired meant exhausted from working multiple jobs. Tired meant beaten down by a man who took more than he gave. Tired meant drowning in a life she couldn't escape while trying to keep her children alive. Does he live with you? Silas asked carefully, watching her face for any sign that he was pushing too hard. She nodded reluctantly, her eyes dropping to study the pattern on the tile floor. And does he hurt you? Silas's voice was barely above a whisper now, but the question hit like thunder. Her eyes flickered up to meet his for just a moment before darting away again. And in that brief connection, he saw years of pain compressed into a 10-year-old's gaze. She didn't answer with words. She didn't have to, because her silence said everything, because the fading bruise on her jaw said everything, because the way she'd flinched when Rex grabbed her wrist said absolutely everything. Silas exhaled slowly, his chest tight with anger. He had no right to show this frightened child. "Let's get the milk for your brother." She looked up quickly, confusion and disbelief warring on her small face. "But I told you already. I can't pay right now. I didn't ask you for payment," Silas interrupted gently, his eyes soft but determined. "I asked you what your brother needs." Nyla's throat tightened, and when she spoke her voice cracked with exhaustion that went far beyond this one night. "Zion cries so much at night. Mama tries really hard to make him quiet so Rex doesn't get mad and start yelling or throwing things." The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, so conditioned to accept violence as normal, so resigned to a life where a baby's cries were dangerous, made something deep inside Silas's chest ache with a pain he thought he'd buried 3 years ago. He walked to the dairy aisle with purpose, grabbed a fresh carton of baby formula, then added a pack of diapers, a soft blanket that looked warm enough for winter, and some mashed fruit in small containers that babies could eat. The cashier, Gloria, scanned each item without looking up, but when everything was bagged, she met Silas's eyes and said quietly, "Sir, thank you for stepping in back there. Most people just pretend they don't see these things." Silas handed her his card and replied with a sadness that came from experience. Most people don't look long enough to see the truth hiding in plain sight. He paid quickly and handed the heavy bag to Nyla, who held it like she was carrying treasure worth more than gold, her small arms straining slightly under the weight, but her grip fierce and protective. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion she didn't know how to name. "I mean it. I really, really mean it." "Nyla," Silas said gently, kneeling once more so they were eye to eye. "Do you know my name?" She shook her head, her dark braids swaying slightly. "It's Silas." Her eyes widened just a bit, processing the sound. Like silence. A faint smile touched his lips, the first genuine expression he'd allowed himself in longer than he could remember. Exactly like silence. They walked outside together, and a brutal wind immediately whipped across the street, cutting through fabric and skin like it was nothing, making Nyla pull her thin jacket tighter around her small frame, even though it did almost nothing against the cold. Without a word, Silas took the store blanket from the bag and placed it over her shoulders with a gentleness that made her flinch. Not from fear this time, but from the shock of kindness, because she wasn't used to hands that helped instead of hurt. "Nyla," he said carefully, watching her face, "tell me the truth. Are you safe where you live?" Her lip trembled, and for a moment he thought she might cry, but she held it together with the kind of strength that came from too much practice. "Sometimes. When Rex isn't drinking, when he's in a good mood, when nothing goes wrong." She paused, then added in a whisper, "But that's not very often anymore." "And your mother?" Silas pressed gently. "She tries really hard to keep him happy, so he doesn't get mad at me or Zion," Nyla said, her voice small and sad. "She's scared all the time now. I can see it in her eyes, even when she smiles." Silas nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him, because fear could take over a home long before the first fist ever flew, because he'd seen it before, because the world was full of children suffering in silence while adults looked the other way. A truck rumbled down the street in the distance, its engine growling through the night air. Nyla's entire body tensed instantly, her shoulders going rigid, her breathing stopping mid-breath. "He came back," she whispered, terror evident in every syllable. "That's his truck." Silas positioned himself slightly in front of her, his body language shifting into something protective and immovable. "Nyla," he said with a calmness that seemed impossible given the circumstances, "if you want to leave tonight, even just for one night to be safe, I will help you get somewhere he can't find you." Her breath hitched in her throat, caught between hope and fear. "He'll follow us. He always finds out everything." "Then we won't go anywhere he can find you," Silas said simply, like it was the most obvious solution in the world. She looked up at him with eyes that held 1,000 questions, 1,000 doubts, 1,000 years of disappointment compressed into one searching gaze. And for the first time, Silas saw the heartbreaking truth behind her brave little face. She wasn't scared of running away or getting caught, or even what Rex might do if he found them. She was scared of believing someone might actually help her, scared of trusting that this stranger's kindness was real, scared that if she let herself hope again, it would be ripped away and leave her more broken than before. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. Why? Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Silas swallowed hard against the memories flooding back, against the image of his daughter's face the last time he'd seen her alive, against 3 years of guilt and grief that had hollowed him out from the inside. Because sometimes, he said softly, his own voice thick with emotion he rarely let himself feel, life give you a second chance to do the right thing when you fail the first time. She blinked, confused and hopeful, and trying desperately not to trust him too quickly, because trust had betrayed her before. Before he could say another word, before he could explain the daughter he'd lost or the fire that had taken everything or the guilt that haunted him every single day, Rex's truck screeched to a violent halt at the curb, tires squealing, engine roaring like an angry beast. He stepped out into the snowy night, and even from 20 feet away, Silas could see the rage radiating off him in waves. Silas whispered urgently, "Stay behind me. Don't move." Nyla's small hand gripped the edge of his jacket so tightly her knuckles turned white, and the night split open with danger all over again. More threatening than before, because now Rex knew someone was standing between him and what he considered his property. The tires screeched like wounded animals as Rex's truck roared down the snowy street, headlights cutting through the darkness like twin knives hunting for prey, and Nyla froze completely, her entire body going rigid as she clutched the milk carton and blanket to her chest, so hard her arms ached. Fear gripped her spine like ice water flooding through her veins, paralyzing every thought except one. Run. Run now. Run before it's too late. Silas's eyes narrowed with the sharp focus of someone calculating odds and exits, someone who'd learned long ago that staying calm in chaos was the difference between survival and disaster. "Nyla, hold my hand and stay close to me," he whispered with an urgency that cut through her panic, and she obeyed instantly, her small fingers gripping his jacket like it was the only solid thing left in a world spinning out of control. They darted into a narrow alley between two brick buildings, their feet crunching through fresh snow that seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence, every step echoing like drum beats announcing their location to anyone listening. The cold air burned Nyla's lungs as she ran, but she couldn't let herself stop, couldn't let Zion go hungry tonight, couldn't let this stranger's kindness be for nothing. Rex's voice boomed behind them, ricocheting off the alley walls with terrifying clarity. "Nyla, you stop right now, or you'll be sorry." Her lungs burned with exertion and fear, but something deeper pushed her forward. The image of Zion's tiny face, his weak cries, his desperate need for the formula she carried. She glanced sideways at Silas, who wasn't just running blindly like she was. He was calculating, observing, thinking 2 steps ahead of a man fueled purely by rage and the need to control. A metal garbage bin suddenly tipped over with a deafening crash as Rex's truck skidded dangerously close to the alley entrance, its bumper scraping brick and sending sparks flying into the darkness. Silas grabbed Nyla's arm and pulled her behind a stack of wooden crates, pressing her small body down low where shadows pooled thickest. "Stay down," he whispered against her ear, his hand gentle but firm on her shoulder. "Don't make a single sound, don't even breathe loud." Nyla's small body trembled uncontrollably, cold and fear mixing together until she couldn't tell which was worse. "Will he find us?" she whispered, her voice so quiet it was barely more than breath. Silas's sharp eyes flicked toward the street where Rex's silhouette moved past the alley entrance, backlit by street lamps and swirling snow. "He'll try his hardest, but he won't know exactly where we are. Not yet. Not if we're smart." They crawled on hands and knees toward the back exit of the alley, Where the faint glow of an abandoned cafe's emergency light beckoned like a distant lighthouse in a storm. Inside the cafe, dust motes danced lazily in weak moonlight that filtered through cracked windows, and everything smelled like old coffee grounds and abandonment. Silas moved with swift precision, his eyes surveying every shadow, every potential hiding spot, every exit route in case they needed to run again. Nyla peeked carefully through the cracked door and saw the truck's headlights passing slowly by the alley entrance, searching, hunting, refusing to give up. Her relief lasted exactly 3 seconds before a voice hissed from somewhere behind the counter, making her blood turn to ice. "Who's there? Who's in my cafe?" Nyla froze completely, every muscle locking up, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst through her ribs. Silas held up one finger in front of his lips, signaling absolute silence, his own body coiled tight, like a spring ready to explode into action. Then, breaking the suffocating tension, a rat scurried across the dusty floor, its claws scratching against old linoleum, and Nyla exhaled so quietly only Silas heard it. But Silas didn't relax. Something in the alley had shifted, some subtle change in the air or the shadows or the quality of silence that only someone who'd survived real danger could recognize. A faint crunch of snow outside, deliberate and careful, made his entire body stiffen with fresh alertness. "Nyla," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "We need to move again. Right now." Her stomach sank like a stone dropped into deep water because she thought they were safe, thought they'd escaped, thought maybe for once something would go right. But Rex was relentless, and danger wasn't finished with him. Not by a long shot. Every step forward seemed to pull her deeper into a world she'd never wanted but couldn't escape. A world where safety was always temporary and fear was the only constant. And she realized with crushing clarity that running was just the beginning of a much longer, much more dangerous night. The entire community is discussing what Nyla should do right now. Should she go back for her mother or stay in the safe house? Don't miss the next chapter or the discussion. Subscribe to the channel and comment stay or go so we know where your moral compass points. Silas led Nyla through a maze of backstreets that twisted and turned like a labyrinth designed to confuse anyone trying to follow. Every corner looking identical to the last, every shadow holding potential danger. He moved like smoke through the darkness, silent and deliberate, his footsteps barely making a sound despite the snow crunching under Nyla's smaller feet. Her tiny legs ached with exhaustion that went bone deep, her lungs burned from the cold air and constant running, but she didn't dare complain because Zion needed this milk, needed this chance, needed her to be stronger than a 10-year-old should ever have to be. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, they reached a nondescript door hidden behind a thick tangle of dead ivy that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Silas tapped a sequence on the door frame that Nyla couldn't quite see or understand, something deliberate and specific, and she heard a soft click as the lock disengaged from the inside. He opened the door carefully, revealing a small safe house that hit Nyla like a wave of impossible comfort. Warmth wrapped around them like the softest blanket she'd ever felt, immediately thawing her frozen fingers and cheeks. Inside, there were bunk beds with actual mattresses and clean sheets, thick blankets folded neatly at the foot of each bed, and a small kitchenette that looked like it actually worked. Shelves lined one wall, holding glass jars of food with handwritten labels that said things like soup and pasta and fruit, all organized with a care that suggested someone had thought deeply about the people who might need this place. A few toys were scattered on the floor near the bottom bunk, a teddy bear missing one eye, some worn building blocks, a picture book with a torn cover. And Nyla's eyes widened because she hadn't known that warmth and safety like this existed outside of fairy tales and dreams. Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling with exhaustion and disbelief, unable to process that this hidden sanctuary was real. "This is a place where you'll be safe," Silas said, his voice carrying a certainty that made her want to believe him desperately. "For now, just stay here and rest." I'll figure out how to get your brother and your mother here too, if I can convince her to trust me. Nyla sank onto the lower bunk, her legs finally giving out, still clutching the blanket and formula like they might disappear if she loosened her grip even slightly. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. Could she really trust this stranger? Was this actually safe? Would Rex somehow find them here? Was this all just a dream that would evaporate when she opened her eyes? She peeked nervously out the small window, her heart still hammering, and saw that the alley outside was empty and quiet, covered in untouched snow that looked almost peaceful. But fear lingered in her chest like smoke that refused to clear, because Rex didn't give up easily, because he had power and anger and a terrifying sense of ownership over her life that she had never agreed to but couldn't escape. Silas knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her thin shoulder with a touch that held no threat, only comfort. "I know this feels scary and overwhelming," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with an honesty that felt foreign in her world of lies and manipulation. "But you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry this by yourself." Her lips trembled as she fought back tears that had been building for weeks, maybe months, maybe her entire life. She wanted to believe him more than she'd ever wanted anything, but she had been betrayed too many times by promises that turned to dust. She swallowed hard, trying to hold herself together, trying to be brave for Zion, even though she was just a scared little girl who desperately wanted someone to tell her everything would be okay. Then her eyes landed on something that made her breath catch. On the small counter sat a notebook lying open, its pages covered with drawings of children, playing, families hugging, and scribbled notes written in careful handwriting that said things like, "Thank you for saving us," and "We made it because of you." Silas noticed her gaze and said gently, "Those are from the people who stayed here before you. Some came alone like you did. Some were scared just like you are. But all of them survived, and all of them found their way to something better." Nyla looked down at her cold hands, still red from the freezing night, and hugged Zion's formula tighter against her chest. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she didn't have to fight every single second just to survive, where safety wasn't a luxury, but a reality, where she could be a kid instead of a soldier. Outside, a shadow flickered across the alley, barely visible in the dim light from a distant street lamp. A figure moving with purpose across the snow-covered street. Silas's entire body tensed, every muscle coiling as he moved silently to the window. He whispered with controlled urgency, "Stay down and don't make a sound." Nyla's stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables, all that fragile hope shattering instantly. Is that him?" Her voice was barely audible, choked with fresh terror. "Yes," Silas said grimly, his jaw tight with determination and something darker. "But he doesn't know we're here yet, and I intend to keep it that way." Her heart raced so fast she felt dizzy, every nerve in her body screaming with adrenaline and fear. Every instinct demanded she move, run, hide deeper, but she forced herself to stay absolutely still. She clutched Zion's milk even tighter and whispered like a prayer, "Please, please just let us be safe." Silas placed his hand gently but firmly on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. "We're not out of danger yet, and I won't lie to you about that. But we've taken the first step towards something better, and sometimes that's all you can do. Take it one step at a time." And with those words, a glimmer of cautious hope flickered in Nyla's chest like a candle flame that refused to go out despite the wind trying to extinguish it. What did she whisper? That whisper is the key to the next phase of this story. And the only way to hear it is to subscribe now, so you don't miss it, where we reveal how Silas finds her mother and what Nyla's one-word promise means for their future. Hit the subscribe button and the bell. A muffled cry pierced through the walls of the safe house, sharp and urgent and unmistakable. Zion's cry, that particular sound only a sibling could recognize instantly, even through distance and walls and fear. Nyla's heart slammed violently against her ribs as the sound reached her ears again, weak but desperate, and she knew with absolute certainty that her baby brother was somewhere out there in the cold night, hungry and scared and crying for her. Her entire body wanted to bolt, to run straight through the door and grab him regardless of danger. But Silas's hand on her shoulder held her back with gentle but firm pressure. "They'll hear you if you run out there now," he said, his voice low and controlled, every word measured and careful. "We move carefully and smart. We get him safely. Then you can hold him and feed him and keep him warm. But if we rush and make mistakes, we risk losing everything." Nyla nodded frantically, swallowing the enormous lump in her throat that felt like it might choke her. She had promised herself she would take care of Zion no matter what, had sworn on everything she held sacred that she would protect him, and she couldn't break that promise now when he needed her most. Silas guided her to a hidden door at the back of the safe house that she hadn't even noticed before, cleverly concealed behind a shelf that swung open on silent hinges. It led to a narrow fire escape, the metal worn and rusted but still sturdy enough to hold their weight. "Step as lightly as you possibly can," he instructed, his eyes scanning the darkness below them. "Every single sound counts right now. Every creak, every breath, every footstep could give us away." They crept down the metal stairs, Silas's boots making only the faintest sounds while the snow crunched softly beneath them. Nyla's heart jumped violently with every tiny echo, every distant car horn, every shadow that moved in her peripheral vision. She thought constantly of Rex, unpredictable, furious, always watching, always 2 steps ahead, and every instinct in her body screamed that danger was everywhere. Finally, they reached the narrow street behind the apartment building where Zion lived with their mother. Silas paused at the corner, his sharp eyes scanning every window, every doorway, every potential threat. "He's inside on the 3rd floor," he whispered, pointing to a dimly lit window. "Stay directly behind me and follow my exact movements. Understand?" Nyla peered through a cracked basement window, and her breath caught in her throat. There he was, her tiny brother Zion, lying in his worn crib that had seen better days, crying softly with the kind of exhausted sobs that came after hours of being ignored. And nearby, casting a long shadow across the cramped room, Rex's silhouette loomed over the crib, muttering something harsh and angry, gesturing violently with his hands in a way that made Nyla's blood run cold. Her breath caught painfully in her chest, trapped between her ribs and her racing heart. She wanted to scream, wanted to run straight through that window and snatch Zion away from danger, wanted to make Rex disappear forever so her family could finally breathe. But she also desperately wanted to survive this night, wanted to see tomorrow, wanted to keep the promise she'd made. Silas assessed the scene with the calculated precision of someone who'd learned to read danger like other people read books, his eyes tracking Rex's movements, noting the layout of the room, calculating angles and timing. Then he leaned close to Nyla and whispered with absolute focus, "When I say go, you run straight to that door, grab your brother as fast as you can, and don't look back no matter what you hear. Don't hesitate, don't second guess, just move. Can you do that?" Nyla's hands shook so violently, she had to clench them in a fist to make them stop. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions. What if Rex catches her? What if the door is locked? What if something goes wrong? But there wasn't time for questions or doubts or fear. All she could do was nod, her throat too tight for words. A car door slammed somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Rex's head turned sharply toward the window, looking out into the darkness, his body language tense and alert. Silas's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Now! Go now!" Nyla sprinted forward with every ounce of strength in her small body, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound in the universe. She reached the building's back entrance, yanked the door open with shaking hands, and bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. She burst into the apartment, ran straight to the crib, and scooped Zion into her arms with a desperation that made her muscles scream. He cried against her chest, his tiny fists grabbing at her jacket, and she shushed him frantically while rocking him the way their mother had taught her. Rex's voice exploded through the apartment like thunder. "Stop them! Stop her right now!" Silas blocked the doorway with his body, a wall of quiet determination and protective fury. A fist collided with the doorframe, splintering old wood and sending splinters flying, but Silas held absolutely firm, unmovable as stone. Nyla ran past him, clutching Zion with every ounce of strength she possessed, every step feeling like it took a lifetime, every breath burning in her lungs. Behind her, the world dissolved into chaos. Shouting, crashing, the sound of struggle. But ahead of her, for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of actual hope. But Rex wasn't finished, not by a long shot, and danger was closing in faster than ever before. The icy wind cut through Nyla's thin jacket like 1,000 frozen knives as she sprinted down the dark alley, clutching Zion against her chest with arms that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. His cries were muffled against her shoulder, but they pierced her heart like daggers anyway. Each weak whimper reminding her that she was all he had right now, that failure wasn't an option, that she had to keep running no matter how badly her legs burned or how much her lungs screamed for air. Behind them, Rex's voice exploded through the night with a rage so raw it seemed to shake the very buildings around them, fueled by alcohol and fury and the desperate need to control what he was losing. "You'll regret this, Nyla. You hear me? You'll regret the day you crossed me." Silas led the way with fierce determination, moving with precise urgency through streets he seemed to know by heart, every turn calculated, every movement purposeful. Every shadow became a threat in Nyla's panicked mind. Every flicker of light on the wet pavement made her flinch. Every sound made her certain that Rex was right behind them, ready to grab her. She glanced back at Silas and saw something different in his face now. Not just determination, but understanding, the look of someone who knew exactly what it meant to run for your life with someone precious in your arms. Their small faces were pale in the dim street light, eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. Yet determination burned fierce in Nyla's gaze because she had made a promise to keep her brother safe, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could make her break that vow. "Stay close to me," Silas barked, ducking suddenly under a low-hanging fire escape ladder that appeared out of nowhere in the darkness. Nyla followed without hesitation, barely noticing her freezing toes anymore, barely registering the pain shooting through her arms from holding Zion's weight for so long. All she could feel was the sheer, desperate will to survive burning through every cell in her body. Rex's truck roared into view at the end of the street like a metal beast hunting prey, its headlights slicing through the darkness with blinding intensity. "Stop right there," he yelled, his voice cracking with fury and something else, desperation, maybe, or fear of losing the power he'd wielded for so long. "You think you could just take what's mine?" Nyla's stomach dropped so violently, she thought she might be sick right there in the snow. She had no idea how a 10-year-old girl could possibly outrun a grown man in a truck, had no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other, had nothing but pure survival instinct driving her forward. But Silas had a plan. He always had a plan. He grabbed her free hand and motioned frantically toward a chain-link fence running along the side of the alley, its metal links crusted with ice and old snow. "Jump over it. Now!" For one terrible moment, pure terror paralyzed her completely. Then she thought of Zion's fragile body trembling against her chest, thought of all the nights she had held him while hunger gnawed at both of them, thought of the promise she had whispered into his tiny ear 1,000 times. "I'll keep you safe. I swear I will." She jumped, arms wrapped protectively around her brother, and landed roughly on the other side with an impact that shot pain through her legs like electricity. She stumbled, but didn't fall, didn't let herself fall, because falling meant losing everything. Silas followed immediately, barely making a sound despite his size, moving like a shadow, made solid. Together they disappeared into the maze of backstreets while Rex's curses and the truck's blaring engine faded slowly behind them, swallowed by distance and darkness. Nyla's breath came in ragged gasps that tore her throat, each inhale feeling like swallowing broken glass. "Will he?" she began, unable to finish the question because speaking required air she didn't have. Silas shook his head firmly, his own breathing heavy but controlled. "He'll keep looking for you, keep hunting, keep trying to get you back. But not tonight. Not while I'm with you and breathing. For the first time in what felt like hours, maybe weeks, maybe her entire life, a fragile thread of hope took root somewhere deep in Nyla's chest. It wasn't much, just a tiny spark in an ocean of darkness, but it was real and warm and alive. But she was learning fast that hope wasn't a destination you reached. It was something you had to fight for with every single breath, something that could be snatched away in an instant if you stopped being vigilant, something that required courage she wasn't sure she possessed, but was discovering she might have anyway. Silas guided Nyla and Zion through the darkness to a small, completely inconspicuous door tucked between two abandoned storefronts whose windows were covered with plywood and old graffiti. "In here, quickly," he whispered with urgency that left no room for questions or hesitation. The key turned silently in the lock with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the frozen night, revealing a tiny room that hit Nyla like stepping into a different world entirely. It smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a deeply human smell that meant safety and warmth and normalcy, things she'd almost forgotten existed. Nyla sank immediately to the floor, her legs finally giving out after running for what felt like miles, still holding Zion protectively against her chest, even though every muscle in her arms screamed with exhaustion. His tiny fists twitched against her shoulder as he nuzzled closer, seeking warmth and comfort in the sister who'd always been there when their mother couldn't be. "It's okay, baby," she whispered into his soft hair, her voice breaking with emotions she'd been holding back for hours. "We're safe now. We made it. I told you I'd keep you safe." Tears burned hot in her eyes, threatening to spill over, but she held them back through sheer force of will because crying felt like admitting how terrified she'd been, how close they'd come to losing everything. Silas scanned the room with sharp, calculating eyes, noting every detail. The lack of obvious exits besides the door they'd entered through, the soundproofing material visible in the walls, the reinforced door that looked like it could withstand serious force. "We can stay here for the night," he said with certainty that made her want to believe him. "You'll be safe here. No one can get to you. Not through that door. Not through these walls." Nyla nodded weakly, but her survival instincts screamed caution like alarm bells that refused to be silenced. "Why?" she started, her voice small and uncertain. "Why are you helping me like this? You don't even know me." Silas hesitated, and in that pause Nyla saw something flicker across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret, or the weight of memories he carried like stones in his pockets. He wasn't used to explaining himself to anyone, much less a 10-year-old child who'd been hurt too many times to trust easily. "Because someone once needed help when I wasn't there to give it," he said softly, each word carrying the weight of years of guilt and grief. "And I failed them when they needed me most. I won't fail again. I can't." Her eyes widened slightly, processing this glimpse into a pain she didn't fully understand but somehow recognized anyway. You understand what it's like?" He nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "I understand what it's like to be alone, to be scared, to feel powerless while the world crashes down around you. That's exactly why I'm here now." Nyla hugged Zion tighter against her chest, her small frame trembling with exhaustion and relief and something else, gratitude, maybe, or the beginning of trust. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a life where fear didn't dominate every single moment, where she didn't have to fight constantly just to survive another day, where safety wasn't a fantasy but something she could actually touch and hold. But even as warmth seeped into her frozen bones and Zion's breathing steadied against her shoulder, danger still lurked outside, like a predator circling wounded prey. Rex didn't give up. Men like him never did, couldn't let go of what they considered theirs. Suddenly, the faint sound of tires crunching slowly on snow made them both freeze like statues. Silas's hand shot up, signaling absolute silence. "Stay down and don't move," he whispered with intensity that made her blood run cold all over again. He moved silently to the small window and peered carefully through a gap in the curtain, his body language shifting into high alert. Is that him?" Nyla's voice was barely audible, choked with fresh terror that threatened to drown her. Yes, Silas said grimly, his expression hardening into something dangerous. But he doesn't know we're here yet. He's searching, guessing, hoping to get lucky. Her heart raced so violently she thought everyone within a mile could probably hear it pounding. Every nerve in her body screamed with adrenaline. Every instinct demanded she grab Zion and run, even though there was nowhere left to run to. She clutched her brother closer and whispered like a desperate prayer to whoever might be listening, "Please, please just let us be safe this one time." Silas placed his hand gently but firmly on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment when panic threatened to consume her completely. "We're not out of danger yet, and I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. But we've taken an important step tonight. We got you away from immediate harm. We got your brother safe, and sometimes that's all you can do in one night. Take it one step at a time." And with those honest words that didn't promise miracles but offered real hope, a glimmer of cautious optimism flickered stubbornly in Nyla's exhausted heart. Silas sat down heavily across from Nyla in the dim light that cast long shadows across his weathered face, and she noticed for the first time the deep lines of grief etched around his eyes like permanent scars. "Do you know why I stay out of the world? Why I hide from cameras and reporters and all the noise?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the question feel enormous. Nyla shook her head slowly, her dark braids swaying slightly, curiosity mixing with exhaustion in her young face. "Because you're really rich and famous people bother you?" He smiled faintly, but it was the saddest smile she'd ever seen, one that didn't come anywhere close to reaching his eyes. "No, it's because 3 years ago I lost the two most important people in my entire life, my wife Maria and my daughter Sophie, and it was my fault that I couldn't save them when they needed me most." Nyla blinked rapidly, completely unsure what to say because she had never heard a grown-up talk like this before, had never seen an adult be this honest about their pain. She thought adults were supposed to be invincible and untouchable, thought they had all the answers, and never felt the kind of crushing fear she lived with every day. But Silas was different. He was human, broken in ways she could see, and yet somehow still determined to help her. "There was a fire," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "An electrical fire that started in the walls while I was at a business meeting across town. By the time I got the call and raced home, the flames had already consumed half the house. I could hear Sophie screaming for me from her bedroom window on the second floor, could see her little face pressed against the glass, could hear her calling, 'Daddy, help me,' over and over." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and Nyla noticed tears gathering in the corners of his eyes that he didn't bother to hide. "The firefighters held me back. They said the structure was too unstable, that I'd die if I went in, that they needed to wait for proper equipment. But Sophie didn't have time to wait. By the time they got her out," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence, and Nyla understood without needing the words that his daughter hadn't survived. "After that night, I lived in silence," Silas said, his voice hollow with pain that clearly hadn't faded even after 3 years. "I buried myself in work and money and buildings and investments, thinking maybe if I made enough money or controlled enough things I could fill the emptiness inside me. But nothing worked. Nothing could replace them or undo what happened or take away the guilt that eats at me every single day." Nyla's small hands trembled in her lap as she processed this revelation. I just wanted Zion to be okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just wanted him to have food and be warm and not cry so much." "And you will keep him safe," Silas said with fierce certainty, leaning forward so their eyes met directly. "I promise you that. I don't make empty promises anymore. I learned the hard way that words without action are worthless. But actions? Actions can change everything." She looked up at him with tears now streaming freely down her cheeks, all the fear and exhaustion and hope and confusion overwhelming her at once. "Why? Why would you help me when you don't even know me? When I'm nobody?" He reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with surprising tenderness. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be safe, Nyla. Everyone deserves someone who will stand between them and danger. And sometimes, when you've failed the people you loved most, helping someone else becomes the only way to live with yourself. She understood then, in that moment of raw honesty between a broken billionaire and a terrified child, that his help wasn't charity. It was redemption, his chance to save the daughter he couldn't reach 3 years ago. "Tomorrow," Silas said, his voice regaining some strength and determination, "we make a real plan. We protect your brother, we get your mother out if she'll trust us, and we make sure Rex can never hurt any of you again." Nyla nodded, clutching Zion closer. "And you'll stay with us? You won't disappear?" "Yes," Silas replied, and she heard the oath in that single word. "I'll be with you every step of the way." But as the night deepened and the city settled into uneasy sleep around them, Silas couldn't shake the gnawing truth that kept him awake. Rex was clever and ruthless and unpredictable, and this situation would not end quietly or easily. Nyla curled up against the wall with Zion in her arms, still clutching the formula like it was made of gold, still trembling slightly even in the warmth and safety. Outside, shadows moved slowly through the falling snow, and danger waited patiently for its next opportunity to strike. Nyla woke to the faint creak of the safe house floorboards, a sound so subtle most people would have missed it entirely. But when you've spent your whole life listening for danger the way other kids listen for ice cream trucks, you learn to hear everything. Her heart slammed violently against her ribs as Zion stirred restlessly in her arms, his tiny fists clenching the blanket while making soft whimpering sounds that threatened to grow louder. Something wasn't right. She could feel in her bones, in the electricity charging the air, in the way the shadows seemed to move with purpose rather than randomly. The wind outside had shifted, carrying with it an unusual sound that didn't belong to the normal city hum of distant traffic and humming streetlights, but something deliberate and cautious and searching, like a predator circling its prey. Silas was already awake and crouched by the door like a coiled spring, his eyes sharp and alert in the dim light filtering through the curtains, and the tension radiating from his body made Nyla's blood run cold, because if someone as strong and capable as Silas was worried, then they were in serious danger. She wanted desperately to ask what was happening, wanted to demand answers and reassurance, but the words caught in her throat like broken glass because her survival instinct screamed one clear message: stay absolutely silent. Don't even breathe loud, become invisible. A shadow flickered against the wall near the window, moving too deliberately to be random, too calculated to be innocent, and Nyla's stomach dropped like she'd just fallen off a cliff. Was it Rex outside hunting for them? Was it someone else he'd sent? Was it the police who might take Zion away and put her in foster care? The thought made her clutch her brother even tighter until he squirmed slightly in protest. Silas held up a single finger without turning around, a clear signal that meant one thing: stay completely quiet and don't move a muscle. Nyla pressed Zion closer to her chest, trying desperately to keep her own shaking under control, trying to regulate her breathing so it wouldn't give them away. Each second stretched impossibly long, heavy and suffocating, the kind of seconds that make a child feel decades older than they should, that steal innocence and replace it with the bitter knowledge that safety is always temporary. She thought of her mother trapped in that apartment with Rex, terrified for their lives, but powerless to escape, and a helplessness clawed at Nyla's chest like a living thing, mixing with her own fear until she couldn't tell where one emotion ended and another began. Suddenly, a faint whisper drifted up from the stairwell outside, barely audible but unmistakably human, and Nyla jumped so violently she nearly dropped Zion. Silas's hand shot out lightning fast, steadying her with gentle pressure that somehow conveyed both comfort and urgent warning. He leaned close enough that his breath tickled her ear and whispered so quietly she barely heard him. "That's him. That's Rex." Panic surged through her like ice water, flooding her veins, freezing her muscles, and stopping her thoughts. "But how did he find us?" she breathed back, her voice smaller than a mouse's whisper. Silas's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cords, and she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "He's not smart enough to track us this well on his own. He's just relentless, methodical, checking every possible hiding spot in the neighborhood until he gets lucky. They crouched together behind a wooden crate as the shadow outside moved closer, footsteps scraping against concrete with deliberate slowness. Nyla felt sweat freeze on her back despite the room's warmth, felt her heart hammering so loud she was absolutely certain everyone within a mile could hear it echoing. Her mind raced through terrible possibilities. If Rex got inside, if he found Zion, if he dragged them back to that apartment where her mother's fear lived in every corner, she couldn't bear it, wouldn't survive it. Silas's fingers brushed the small of her back, grounding her before panic could completely take over. "We're not giving him the satisfaction of catching us," he said with calm determination that felt impossible given the circumstances. "We've come too far tonight to surrender now." The footsteps outside paused for what felt like an eternity, and in that silence Nyla could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. Then nothing, just crushing, suffocating silence that somehow felt more threatening than any sound could be. A faint scratching sound drew her gaze to the window, and her breath caught painfully in her throat. Outside in the snow, barely visible in the weak light from a distant street lamp, a figure lurked with its hood drawn low, posture tense and alert, and the faint light reflected off something metallic in his hand, something that looked horribly like a weapon. Rex wasn't just angry anymore. He'd come prepared for violence, ready to do whatever it took to reclaim what he considered his property. And for the first time, Nyla realized with crushing certainty that escaping once wasn't going to be enough, that Rex would keep hunting them night after night until either he won or something stopped him permanently. Morning came gray and brittle, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave no matter how many blankets you pile on, and Nyla clutched Zion against her chest while watching Silas survey the street from the safe house window with eyes that never stopped moving, never stopped calculating threats. The snow had muted the world outside into an eerie silence, but Rex's presence was unmistakable, a lingering shadow that paced just beyond their line of sight, a threat that didn't need to be seen to be felt in every nerve ending. Silas turned away from the window with grim determination etched into every line of his face. "We have to move right now. We can't stay here another hour." Nyla swallowed hard against the fear rising in her throat like bile. Where can we possibly go that he won't find us?" "To a place no one will think to look, a place I've kept secret for years, specifically for situations like this," Silas said with the kind of certainty that made her want to believe him despite every reason not to. "And we're going to get your mother too, if she'll trust me enough to leave with us." Nyla hesitated, her mind flooding with doubts because her mother had tried to leave Rex twice before, and both times had ended with more bruises and more fear and more reasons to believe escape was impossible. But the fire in Silas's eyes, that same fierce determination that had faced down Rex at the grocery store, made her think that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. He handed her a small backpack he'd pulled from a hidden cabinet, and when she opened it she found diapers, formula, a warm blanket, and several small jars of baby food carefully packed inside. "This isn't forever," he said gently, kneeling so their eyes met at the same level. "But it's a solid start, and sometimes starting is the hardest part." They moved through narrow alleys with Silas leading and Nyla following close behind, shielding Zion against the bitter wind that cut through the streets like invisible knives. Every corner felt like a potential trap. Every shadow looked like it might contain Rex waiting to ambush them. Every distant sound made her pulse spike with fresh adrenaline. Her legs burned from exhaustion, but her fear propelled her forward, step after painful step, because survival demanded movement even when your body screamed for rest. She thought constantly of Rex's unpredictable temper, of the purple bruises he'd left on her mother's arms just last week, of the fear that lived in every corner of their apartment like toxic mold you couldn't see but could always feel poisoning the air, and she pushed those memories down deep to focus on the only thing that mattered, keeping Zion safe and getting through the next 5 minutes without getting caught. At a crossroads between two crumbling buildings, Silas paused and turned to her with serious eyes. "Listen carefully, Nyla. I need to create a distraction that will draw Rex's attention away from you. When I give you the signal, you run as fast as you've ever run with Zion straight down that passageway there. Don't look back no matter what you hear. Don't stop for anything. Don't second-guess yourself. Just run until you reach the blue door at the end and wait for me there. Do you understand? Nyla nodded, her throat too tight for words, determination hardening inside her chest like steel being forged in fire. She had promised to keep Zion safe, had sworn on everything she held sacred, and that promise was worth every risk, every ounce of courage she could scrape together from the bottom of her terrified soul. Silas slipped out into the open street deliberately, letting himself be visible in a way that made Nyla's stomach clench with worry. Rex's attention snapped to him immediately like a predator spotting movement. "There you are, you interfering piece of," Rex shouted, his voice carrying rage that had been building all night. Nyla seized the moment exactly as Silas had instructed, clutching Zion tight against her chest and darting down the hidden passageway he'd shown her just minutes before. Her legs burned with exertion. Her lungs screamed for air, but her fear and love for her brother propelled her forward faster than she'd ever moved in her life. Behind her, she heard the confrontation erupting, muffled shouting, a crash that sounded like breaking glass. Silas's calm voice cutting through chaos with commanding authority that somehow never rose to a yell. She couldn't see what was happening, couldn't know if Silas was winning or losing or getting hurt, but she trusted him in a way she'd never trusted any adult before. Finally, gasping and shaking, she reached the small blue door at the end of the narrow passage. Her heart pounded so violently it felt like it might burst through her ribs as she turned the cold metal handle with trembling fingers, hoping desperately it would lead to safety and not another trap. The door opened into a narrow, heated corridor that smelled faintly of old wood and safety. Warmth enveloped her like a soft promise, like arms she'd been desperately seeking her whole life. She dared to exhale for the first time in what felt like hours. But in her mind, one terrible thought stayed lodged like a splinter she couldn't remove. Silas was facing Rex alone, and she knew exactly how dangerous Rex could be when cornered. Nyla's mother, Serena, sat motionless in her cramped apartment, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape, while she listened to Rex's angry pacing on the floor above, each heavy footstep making the ceiling creak and her stomach clench with familiar dread. Every sip of water she tried to take trembled violently in her shaking hands, spilling droplets on her worn jeans, and she hated herself with burning intensity for being so terrified of a man she'd once thought she loved. Hated herself even more for failing to protect her children from the monster he'd become. She loved her babies with a fierceness that defied description. Nyla with her brave little face, trying so hard to be strong. Zion with his innocent eyes that didn't yet understand the world's cruelty. But fear had taken up permanent residence in her chest years ago, squeezing tighter with each passing month until she could barely remember what breathing freely felt like. She thought of Zion, her youngest and most vulnerable, somewhere out in the freezing world without her protection, and her heart physically ached like someone had reached inside her chest and squeezed. She thought of Nyla, always so impossibly brave and resourceful, always trying to fix problems no 10-year-old should ever have to face, and guilt crushed her because her daughter shouldn't have to be the strong one, shouldn't have to parent herself while Serena cowered in fear. A sudden, sharp knock at the apartment door made her jump so violently that water sloshed over the rim of her glass. "Who is it?" she demanded, trying desperately to keep her voice from shaking and failing completely. "Open this door right now." "Serena," Rex growled from the other side, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant violence was coming soon. "We need to talk about your little runaway daughter." Serena's stomach sank like an anchor dropping into dark water. He had discovered Nyla was missing, had figured out that someone had helped her escape, and now his rage would be looking for a target, and she was the closest, most convenient victim. "Rex, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Let's just talk calmly about this. No more talking," he snapped, his fist slamming against the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I want them back. Both of those kids belong here, and I'm going to find them even if I have to tear this entire neighborhood apart brick by brick. Serena's trembling hands fumbled for her phone on the coffee table, and her eyes widened when she saw a new message notification glowing on the screen. With shaking fingers, she opened it, hardly daring to hope, and read the words that appeared. Safe. Follow instructions. Trust him. Her breath caught in her throat as tears of relief and confusion flooded her eyes. Nyla had somehow managed to send a signal? How was that even possible? She read the message 3 more times, each word sinking deeper into her consciousness. And for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt the tiniest flicker of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. A loud crash from the living room downstairs made her flinch so hard she nearly dropped the phone. Rex was moving through the apartment now, getting closer, his heavy footsteps deliberate and threatening. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to hide, to make herself small and invisible, to wait for his rage to pass like she'd done 100 times before. But this time was different. This time her children were counting on her to be brave, to make a choice not born from fear, but from love and desperate courage. She grabbed her coat with trembling hands, pulled on her gloves despite her fingers shaking so badly she could barely grip the fabric, and stuffed a small bag with essentials. Identification, a few photographs, the tiny bit of cash she'd been hiding in a coffee can for 3 years. Nyla and Zion were counting on her, trusting that she would find the strength to leave, believing she could be the mother they deserved, instead of the frightened shell she'd become. Tonight, something fundamental had shifted inside her chest. The hunted were no longer going to stay powerless and passive. For the first time since Rex had moved into their lives and slowly taken control of everything, Serena made a decision driven not by terror of what he might do, but by fierce love for what her children needed. But Rex's footsteps were getting closer, his shadow visible under the door crack, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would not let her go easily. Men like him never released their grip willingly. The storm outside her window perfectly mirrored the chaos inside her heart. Wild, relentless, and dangerously close to destroying everything in its path. Nyla clutched Zion to her chest with arms that ached from hours of holding him, shivering violently in the icy wind as the city lights blurred past them like streaks of paint on a dark canvas, while Silas's black SUV roared along the empty highway at speeds that made her stomach lurch. The tires squealed against snow and black ice with sounds that reminded her of wounded animals, and every sharp turn pressed her against the door so hard she thought she might go flying through the window. Behind them, cutting through the darkness like the eyes of some mechanical predator that refused to give up the hunt, a dark sedan followed with relentless determination, matching their every turn, closing the distance whenever Silas had to slow for dangerous curves. "Hold on tight, and don't let go of your brother," Silas shouted over the roar of the engine, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he swerved violently to avoid a patch of black ice that could have sent them spinning into the guardrail. Nyla's stomach lurched so hard she tasted bile, but she forced it down and pressed Zion's small body closer to her chest, feeling his tiny fists grip her coat with surprising strength. The fear in his wide eyes made her heart physically ache because babies shouldn't know terror like this, shouldn't understand that the world could be hunting them. The car behind them suddenly accelerated with a roar of engine power that sent fresh adrenaline shooting through Nyla's veins like liquid electricity. Rex's voice somehow pierced through the wind and distance, amplified by pure rage into something almost supernatural. "You can't run forever. I'll find you no matter where you hide." Silas's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cords of steel, and when he spoke his voice carried deadly calm that somehow felt more dangerous than Rex's screaming. "Not today. Not on my watch." He leaned into the wheel with precision that spoke of experience, and the SUV fishtailed slightly on the slick road before he regained perfect control, making tiny corrections that kept them from spinning out. Nyla's teeth chattered uncontrollably, partly from cold, but mostly from pure terror mixed with adrenaline that made every nerve ending feel like it was on fire. She couldn't remember a single moment in her entire life when she had felt so alive and so close to death simultaneously, when every second stretched into an eternity of fear and determination. Zion's sudden cry pierced through the chaos like a knife through fabric, sharp and desperate. "I'm here, baby brother," Nyla whispered fiercely against his soft hair, rocking him as much as the violent movements of the car would allow. "We're almost there, almost safe. I promise you we're going to make it through this." Silas glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and she saw worry etched deep into the lines around his eyes. "We're going to make it, Nyla. You need to trust me on this." She nodded, even though doubt gnawed at her insides like rats chewing through rope, even though every fiber of her being screamed that they were doomed. Every second felt like it might be their last as the snow-covered highway twisted ahead like some impossible maze designed specifically to trap them. Every curve potentially hiding disaster, every patch of ice a death sentence waiting to be triggered. Suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, a shadow darted across the road directly in their path. Maybe a deer, maybe something else she couldn't tell in the darkness and chaos. Silas slammed the brakes with such force that Nyla felt her chest lift violently against the seatbelt, felt the entire world tilt sideways as the tires screamed in protest. The SUV swerved in what felt like slow motion, missing the shadow by inches that felt like miles, fishtailing wildly before Silas wrestled it back under control with movements so precise they seemed almost superhuman. Rex's sedan behind them wasn't nearly as lucky or skilled. It fishtailed violently in response to the sudden brake lights, the driver overcorrecting in panic, and Nyla watched through the rear window in horrified fascination as the dark car spun completely around, headlights flashing wildly in every direction like a lighthouse gone mad before disappearing sideways into a massive snowbank with a crunch of metal that echoed through the frozen night. Nyla exhaled so shakily her entire body convulsed with the release of held breath. Is it over? Do we actually escape? Silas didn't answer immediately, his sharp eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the disabled sedan with an intensity that told her he didn't trust their luck yet. "Not yet, but we've bought ourselves precious time, maybe enough to get you somewhere truly safe." Nyla pressed Zion closer, feeling the warmth of his small body against her own frozen skin, and for just a moment there was relief flooding through her like warm water. But deep in her bones, in that instinct for danger that poverty and fear had sharpened to a razor's edge, she knew with crushing certainty that the chase was far from finished. They arrived at a secluded cabin tucked deep in the woods on the city's outskirts, so hidden by towering pine trees and thick underbrush that you could drive past it 100 times and never know existed. The forest surrounded the small structure like a protective wall built by nature itself, and the fresh snow blanketing everything muffled the world's chaos into an almost sacred silence that felt surreal after the violence of their escape. Silas parked the SUV behind the cabin where it couldn't be seen from any road, and Nyla practically threw herself out of the vehicle, clutching Zion so tightly he squeaked in protest, her legs shaking so badly from adrenaline and exhaustion that she nearly collapsed right there in the snow. Warm air greeted them the moment Silas opened the cabin door, and Nyla felt something inside her chest crack open, not breaking but releasing like a dam that had been holding back months of fear, finally allowing just a tiny bit of relief to seep through. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames already crackling and casting dancing golden light across rough wooden beams and comfortable furniture that looked worn but loved. For the first time in longer than she could remember, weeks, months, maybe her entire life, Nyla felt the faintest whisper of something that might actually be security. This is real," she whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief and desperate hope. "This isn't going to disappear the moment I close my eyes." Silas nodded firmly, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Real as anything in this world. You're safe here, Nyla. No one can get to you through these walls. Not Rex, not anyone. This place has protected people before you, and it will protect you now." Zion gurgled softly in her aching arms, and she realized he was sensing the change in atmosphere, feeling the shift from constant danger to something approaching peace. Nyla held him even tighter, whispering promises into his soft baby hair. "We made it, little brother. We actually made it." Her eyes wandered across the cabin's interior, taking in details she'd been too terrified to notice before. A small shelf lined with children's toys that looked well used but cared for. Books with worn spines suggesting they'd been read dozens of times. A kitchen area that actually had food in the cabinets. On a side table sat a tiny notebook filled with drawings and messages, scribbled notes in different handwriting that said things like, "Thank you for saving my family," and "Hope lives here," and "We survived because you cared." A massive lump rose in Nyla's throat, threatening to choke her with emotions she didn't have names for. People had come through this place before her, had sat by this same fire, had felt this same cautious hope blooming in their terrified hearts. If they had survived, if they had made it to something better, then maybe, just maybe, she and Zion could too. Silas moved quietly through the cabin, methodically checking locks on windows and doors, testing the security system with practiced efficiency, making absolutely certain that every possible entry point was secured. "We can stay here for several days if we need to," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a genuine promise. "Rest, recover, gather our strength, and make a real plan for what comes next." Nyla sank onto a worn but comfortable couch, still refusing to release her grip on Zion, even though her arms screamed with fatigue. For the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined entirely by fear. Mornings without checking if Rex was in a good mood, meals without counting every precious penny, nights without listening for angry footsteps in the hallway. But even surrounded by warmth and flickering firelight and the promise of safety, the tension refused to completely leave her small shoulders. She knew with the certainty that came from too much experience that Rex wouldn't give up, that men like him never stopped hunting what they'd lost, that surrender wasn't in his vocabulary. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the cabin door froze every molecule of air in the room. Nyla's entire body went rigid, her grip on Zion tightening until he whimpered softly. Silas stiffened like a wolf catching a predator's scent. "Do not answer that door," he whispered with controlled urgency. "Stay exactly where you are, and don't make a single sound." The knocking grew louder, more insistent, more demanding, each impact against the wood like a hammer blow directly to Nyla's racing heart. Silas moved silently to the window and peeked carefully through a gap in the curtain, his body language screaming high alert. He exhaled very quietly, and Nyla saw his shoulders relax fractionally. "It's not him. Not yet anyway. Just someone who got lost in the storm." Nyla nodded, but kept trembling anyway, still clutching Zion like he might evaporate if she loosened her grip even slightly. Relief was so fragile, she realized, like thin ice on a frozen pond that could shatter with one wrong step. She understood now that survival wasn't just about escaping immediate danger. It was about staying vigilant every single moment, trusting carefully and slowly, holding on to hope even when the entire world felt like it was trying to crush you. And for the first time in her young life, she truly understood the enormous weight of the promise she'd made in that grocery store. "I will pay when I grow up, I swear." Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows in delicate patterns that looked like nature's own artwork, casting soft golden rays across the cabin's worn wooden floor where Nyla sat near the crackling fire with Zion sleeping peacefully in her lap for the first time in days. She watched Silas unpack supplies from a hidden closet with methodical care. More formula, actual food in cans and boxes, blankets that smelled clean instead of musty, all the things that meant someone had planned for people like her to find refuge here. The warmth of the cabin and the rich smell of coffee brewing in an old percolator created a small pocket of comfort, but her mind still raced with questions that wouldn't stop circling like vultures. Could she really trust him completely? Could she ever let herself believe they were truly safe? Could she stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and crush this fragile happiness? Silas noticed her intense gaze, and set down the supplies, moving to sit across from her with the kind of careful distance that respected her fear. Trust doesn't come instantly, especially not for someone who's been hurt as badly as you have, he said softly, his voice carrying understanding that came from personal experience rather than textbook knowledge. I know what it's like to be let down by people you relied on, to have promises broken when you needed them kept most. But I also know that actions speak louder than any words ever could. Nyla nodded slowly, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. She thought of all the nights she'd spent hiding in closets while Rex raged, of the freezing streets where she'd searched trash bins for anything edible, of the constant fear that had been her only reliable companion for so long. And yet here, in this firelit room, with a stranger who'd risked everything to help her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A sliver of safety, a sense that maybe someone genuinely cared whether she lived or died. You've been through hell and somehow managed to keep your brother safe through all of it, Silas continued, his eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, respect, maybe a recognition of strength he understood personally. I've made terrible mistakes in my past, failed people who counted on me in ways I'll never forgive myself for. But tonight, you and Zion, and your mother if she'll come with us, you're my responsibility now, and I take that more seriously than anything I've ever done in my entire life. Nyla's lips trembled as she fought against tears that wanted to break free like water behind a cracking dam. I want to trust you so badly it hurts. I want to believe that someone actually cares what happens to us. Silas leaned forward slightly, his expression open and honest in a way that made him look vulnerable despite his obvious strength. Then do it. Not because I'm asking you to, not because you have no other choice, but because you deserve to feel safe. You deserve to have someone in your corner who won't abandon you when things get hard. Trust me, because it's your decision to make, and you're choosing hope over fear. Outside the cabin windows, snow fell softly in the early morning light, muffling the forest in a blanket of white that made the world feel clean and new and full of possibility. For the first time in longer than she could measure, Nyla let herself imagine a future where she and Zion could laugh without looking over their shoulders, where they could eat without rationing every bite, where maybe they could even see their mother again without dread shadowing every reunion. Yet even as warmth seeped into her bones and safety felt almost real, the memory of Rex lingered like toxic smoke that refused to clear completely. He would not forget what happened, would not stop searching, would not accept that his control had been broken by a 10-year-old girl and a stranger who decided to interfere. But sitting there by the fire with Zion breathing peacefully and Silas watching over them with genuine care, Nyla realized something powerful and transformative. Trust could be chosen deliberately rather than given blindly, and when chosen wisely with eyes wide open to both risks and possibilities, it could become the strongest weapon she possessed. For the first time in my whole life, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying conviction that surprised even her. Hope doesn't feel like a lie someone told me. It feels real, like something I can actually touch. And in that quiet moment of honest connection between a broken billionaire seeking redemption and a child who'd learned to survive against impossible odds, hope wasn't just a fleeting thought that would disappear with the morning. It was alive, growing, refusing to be extinguished no matter how hard the darkness pushed back. Serena sat trembling on the edge of her bed, hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the crumpled note she clutched in her lap like a lifeline, her mind racing in circles between paralyzing panic and desperate hope. The message from Nyla glowed on her phone screen, safe. Follow instructions. Trust him. And those simple words carried more weight than any speech or promise ever could, because they meant her daughter had somehow found help, had somehow survived the night she'd feared would be their last. Her apartment felt colder than it ever had before, despite the radiator hissing and clanking in the corner, because every shadow seemed alive with threat, every creak of old floorboards sounded like footsteps approaching, every gust of wind against the windows felt like Rex's rage given physical form. She thought of Zion, her baby boy with his innocent eyes and helpless dependence, sleeping somewhere in an unknown safe house, and the physical ache in her chest was so intense she pressed her hand against her heart to make sure it was still beating. She thought of Nyla, her impossibly brave daughter who'd been forced to grow up faster than any child should, always trying to fix problems that should never have been hers to solve, and guilt crashed over Serena in waves so powerful they nearly knocked her sideways. How had she let it come to this? How had she allowed fear to turn her into a ghost haunting her own life while her children suffered? She had to decide right now. Stay hidden and powerless, trapped in this cycle of violence and terror that would eventually destroy them all, or leave everything she knew and follow the faint trail of hope her daughter had somehow managed to leave behind. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest like concrete blocks, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to imagine she possessed the courage required for what came next. She thought of Zion's tiny face, still too young to understand why hunger hurt, and her daughter's determined eyes that had seen far too much suffering. A deep, shuddering breath filled her lungs as decision crystallized in her mind. Serena had to act now, had to be the mother her children deserved instead of the frightened victim she'd become. Fear still gripped her throat like iron fingers, but love, powerful, raw, protective maternal love that could move mountains, pushed her trembling legs to stand. She packed quickly with shaking hands, stuffing a small bag with essentials. Identification documents, a few cherished photographs that captured happier times, the tiny bit of emergency cash she'd been secretly hiding in a coffee can for 3 years, and the children's birth certificates she'd kept safe through everything. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long as she crept toward the door, each step deliberate and measured, every sound amplified by adrenaline until her own heartbeat sounded like thunder in her ears. The cold air outside bit at her exposed skin with teeth made of winter, but she welcomed the sharp pain because it reminded her she was alive, capable of movement, still able to make choices that mattered. Every step away from that apartment was a step toward reclaiming control of a life that had been stolen from her piece by piece. Her thoughts kept returning to Rex. Could she really evade someone who knew her patterns, who'd spent years learning exactly how she thought and moved? Could she make it to wherever Nyla was hiding without being caught? Every instinct that had been honed through years of survival screamed that this was dangerous, possibly suicidal, almost certainly going to end badly. But something stronger than instinct drove her forward now. The fierce determination of a mother who'd finally decided that her children's survival mattered more than her own fear. Halfway down the dark street, moving through shadows and staying away from streetlights, Serena paused as her heart nearly stopped. There, in the distance, barely visible through the falling snow, stood a figure watching the street with deliberate stillness. Not moving yet, but definitely watching, waiting, hunting. Her pulse spiked so violently she felt dizzy, her vision narrowing to a tunnel focused entirely on that distant silhouette. Was it Rex? Another threat? Someone sent to stop her? She couldn't tell through the snow and darkness and distance, but danger radiated from that figure like heat from fire. But there was absolutely no turning back now. Not when her children were counting on her. Not when this might be their only chance at freedom. Not when every fiber of her being screamed that this was the moment that would define the rest of their lives. With her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone within a mile could hear it, Serena whispered to herself like a prayer or an oath. I will find you, Nyla. I swear on everything I am. I will find you and we'll never be apart again. Every step after that carried desperate urgency, and every beat of her racing heart screamed that this night would test every ounce of courage she'd ever possessed or would ever need. The cabin door exploded inward before dawn could fully break, snow whipping inside like frozen daggers as Rex's figure filled the doorway with rage that seemed to make him larger than any human should be, and Nyla froze completely with terror shooting through her veins like ice water while clutching Zion so tightly against her chest that he whimpered. The cold metallic gleam of Rex's determination was unmistakable in his bloodshot eyes that had clearly not slept, in his clenched fists that promised violence. In a way, he stood blocking their only exit like a human wall built from anger and obsession. Silas moved with lightning speed, stepping directly between Rex and the children before Nyla could even process what was happening, his presence steady and unflinching despite the fury radiating from the man in the doorway. "Stay behind me and don't move," Silas said with controlled intensity, every muscle in his body radiating tension and calculated readiness, protective instinct overriding any concern for his own safety. Every fiber of Nyla's being screamed to run, to grab Zion and somehow disappear into thin air, but there was nowhere left to go, no escape route that Rex hadn't already considered and blocked. Rex's wild eyes swept the cabin, taking in the warmth and safety they'd found, and his face twisted with rage, so raw it looked painful. "Hand them over right now. Those kids belong with me and their mother, not hiding in some stranger's cabin like criminals." His voice boomed through the small space, making the windows rattle and Zion cry harder. Nyla's heart raced so violently she felt dizzy, but something deep inside her, some core of steel she developed through months of protecting her brother, made her rock him gently and whisper with fierce determination, "No, you won't take him. Not ever again." Rex snarled like a cornered animal, his face contorting with disbelief that a 10-year-old would dare defy him. "You think you have a choice in this? You think this stranger can protect you from me?" But Silas moved with practiced precision, blocking Rex's advance with body language that spoke of absolute commitment. "Do you think I'm afraid of you?" Rex spat, lunging forward with fists raised. "Fear doesn't make us weak," Silas said with eerie calm that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting ever could, his voice cutting through Rex's rage like a surgical blade. "It makes us alert. It makes us survive. And it makes sure we protect what matters most." Nyla's eyes darted between the two men, watching this clash of wills play out in real time, and she whispered desperately to Zion even though he couldn't understand the words. "It's okay, baby. Mommy and Silas will keep you safe. We won't let the bad man win." Rex growled deep in his throat, trying to physically push past Silas's wall of protection. But every movement was anticipated and countered with movements so precise they seemed almost choreographed. Each strike Rex attempted was deflected, each angle of attack was blocked, each psychological assault was met with unwavering calm that clearly frustrated the violent man beyond measure. "You can't keep this up forever," Rex sneered, breathing heavily from exertion and rage. "They're mine, and eventually you'll slip up or get tired or make one mistake. And when you do, I'll take back what belongs to me." "Not tonight," Silas replied with steel in his voice that allowed zero room for negotiation. "Not tomorrow. Not ever." The snow outside intensified into a full blizzard, wind howling around the cabin walls, blanketing the world in white that somehow made their isolation feel both safer and more dangerous simultaneously. Every shadow flickered with potential threat. Every noise outside could signal Rex's backup arriving. Every moment stretched into painful uncertainty. Nyla's entire body trembled as she realized this wasn't just a physical confrontation. It was emotional warfare, psychological combat, where Rex was losing control he'd wielded for years and couldn't accept that reality. She clutched Zion protectively and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The hunger, the fear, the desperate promise in the grocery store, the kindness of a stranger who'd chosen to help when he could have walked away. For the first time in her young life, she wasn't just a passenger in her own story. Her bravery mattered. Her instinct to protect Zion had started this chain of events. Her refusal to give up had brought them to this moment of potential freedom. The confrontation wasn't just about physical dominance. It was about who would control their future, whether fear would win or courage would prevail, whether Rex's violence would continue defining their lives, or whether this night would mark the beginning of something different. And neither side would back down, because too much was at stake, because the cost of losing was unthinkable, because sometimes the only way forward is straight through the fire. Just as the struggle seemed about to explode into violence that would leave someone seriously hurt, Silas froze mid-movement, his sharp eyes catching something outside the window that made his entire body language shift from combat ready to shocked confusion. "Wait!" he muttered, his voice carrying disbelief and sudden hope that neither Nyla nor Rex understood. Nyla followed his gaze through the frosted glass and gasped so hard she nearly dropped Zion, because standing in the swirling snow behind Rex, completely unnoticed by the enraged man, was a figure she recognized instantly, a tall man in a police uniform with a calculating expression that radiated authority and purpose, someone whose presence changed absolutely everything about this confrontation. Who is that?" Nyla whispered, her voice barely audible over Zion's continued crying and the howling wind outside. Silas's jaw tightened with something that looked like relief mixed with vindication. "This changes everything. Everything." The uniformed man stepped forward deliberately, snow crunching under heavy boots, his hand resting on his duty belt with the casual confidence of someone who dealt with dangerous men 1,000 times before. "Rex," the officer said, his voice cold and measured like winter itself given human speech, "you've been recklessly out of control tonight. You don't get to touch those children. Not now. Not ever again." Rex spun around so fast he nearly lost his balance, his face contorting through a dozen emotions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, fear, confusion, then settling into defensive rage. This is your fault. You ruined everything I built." The officer's expression didn't change even slightly, remaining professionally neutral despite whatever history clearly existed between them. "Everything you try to control through fear and violence, you mean? Consider it permanently undone. These children are not your property to reclaim." Nyla clutched Zion even closer, her mind racing to process this unexpected development that felt almost too good to be true. This was the twist she hadn't seen coming, couldn't have predicted in her wildest imagination. Someone with actual authority over Rex, someone who could enforce justice rather than just promise protection, someone who'd apparently been tracking this situation and had arrived at the exact right moment. Silas finally exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders just fractionally as he realized they weren't alone in this fight anymore. He looked down at Nyla with eyes that said, "See, sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places." Rex hesitated for the first time all night, clearly trying to calculate whether this was a fight he could win or escape from, uncertainty flashing across his features in a way Nyla had never witnessed before. His rage faltered, replaced by something that looked horribly like actual fear as he realized he was cornered by forces more powerful than his fists or intimidation. "Rex, you've been served multiple warnings," the officer continued, pulling official-looking papers from his jacket. "Restraining orders, Child Protective Services investigations, domestic violence reports that somehow kept disappearing. But tonight, with multiple witnesses and attempted kidnapping, your luck has permanently run out." Nyla's heart pounded with something new. Not terror this time, but hope surging through her veins like electricity bringing dead circuits back to life. She glanced at Zion, who'd finally stopped crying and was watching everything with wide, confused baby eyes that didn't understand but somehow sensed the shift in atmosphere. "This is the twist," she whispered to Silas, barely able to believe what was unfolding. Silas knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her trembling shoulder. "See, Nyla, sometimes help comes from places you never expected. Sometimes the good guys actually show up when you need them most." The twist wasn't just a distraction or temporary reprieve. It was a genuine lifeline thrown by someone who'd been working behind the scenes, building a case, waiting for the right moment to intervene with legal authority that Rex couldn't intimidate or manipulate away. For the first time since this nightmare began, Nyla allowed herself to imagine a future where fear didn't dominate every single heartbeat, where she could protect her brother and maybe even see her mother again without trembling, where safety wasn't a fantasy, but an actual possibility she could touch and hold. The night had revealed its surprise, and for once, just this once, the surprise wasn't another disaster but the beginning of actual justice. The night air crackled with tension so thick you could almost see it as Silas, Nyla clutching Zion, and Serena, who'd finally made it through the storm, moved cautiously through the clearing behind the cabin while the distant sound of police sirens grew steadily louder, signaling that backup and real help were finally, actually arriving. Every crunch of snow underfoot made Nyla's stomach twist with anxiety because Rex was still dangerously close, still unpredictable, still capable of one last desperate act of violence before the law could fully intervene. She hugged Zion so tightly against her chest that his tiny body quivered with both fear and exhaustion, feeling every rapid beat of his fragile heart against her own racing pulse. Ahead of them, partially hidden by the edge of the forest where shadows pooled deepest, Rex's silhouette loomed like a nightmare that refused to end even when morning should have brought light. His eyes glinted with a volatile mixture of rage and desperation that made him more dangerous than ever before, like a cornered animal with nothing left to lose and everything to destroy. He had chased them this far through ice and darkness, had refused to accept that his control was shattered, and now with law enforcement closing in and his world collapsing, his fury burned white-hot and completely irrational. "Stay back from him," Silas warned in a voice that was low but carried absolute authority, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to spring into protective action. Every fiber of his being radiated control and determination forged through years of guilt and the fierce need to save these children in ways he couldn't save his own daughter 3 years ago. Rex took one menacing step toward them, his voice trembling with fury, so raw it seemed to tear from his throat. "You think you can just take them from me? I won't let you. They belong with me and their mother, and I'll tear this whole place apart before I let some rich stranger play hero." Nyla's heart pounded so violently she felt dizzy, but something had fundamentally changed inside her chest over this endless night. She wasn't just a terrified child anymore. She was a sister who'd kept her promise, a survivor who'd fought through impossible circumstances, someone who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. The words came to her unbidden, fierce and clear. "I will pay when I grow up. I swear." Silas moved like lightning made solid, positioning himself directly between Rex and the vulnerable family with body language that left zero room for negotiation or compromise. "This ends right now, tonight. You will not touch them again." Rex lunged forward with the desperate violence of someone who'd already lost everything and was making one final, reckless attempt to reclaim control. But Silas was ready, moving with precision that came from purpose rather than rage. Officers emerged from the tree line at exactly that moment, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades of justice finally arriving, and Rex's accomplice, the man who'd appeared earlier, revealed now as a detective who'd been building a case against Rex for months, stepped forward with handcuffs glinting in the patrol car lights. "You're done, Rex," the detective said with cold finality that allowed no argument. "The law is here now, witnesses are secured, and your reign of terror ends tonight." Rex's face twisted through disbelief, fury, then something that looked almost like broken acceptance as officers moved in with professional efficiency, subduing him despite his struggles. Nyla watched the man who had haunted their lives for so long finally being restrained, his power stripped away, his threats rendered hollow, and tears streamed down her face. Not from fear this time, but from overwhelming relief that felt like breathing fresh air after drowning for months. Serena wrapped her arms around both children, her own tears falling freely as she whispered broken apologies and fierce promises. "You did it, baby girl. You saved us. You saved your brother." Silas stood nearby, his eyes scanning the forest perimeter one final time to ensure no threats remained, then finally allowing himself to exhale the tension he'd carried since the grocery store encounter. For the first time since losing his own family 3 years ago, he felt something close to redemption settling into the hollow spaces in his chest. The forest fell silent except for the faint crunch of snow under boots as officers led Rex away in handcuffs, his shadow finally disappearing into flashing lights and official custody. Justice had come, unexpected and powerful, and the night's terrible storm had finally, actually passed. Morning broke with a golden glow that seemed almost impossibly beautiful after the darkness they'd survived. Soft sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and filling every corner with warmth that felt like a promise the universe was finally keeping. Nyla sat near the stone hearth with Zion, sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time in what felt like forever, his tiny face relaxed and innocent, no longer twisted with the fear and hunger that had defined so many of his earliest days. Serena wrapped a thick blanket around both her children, tears of exhaustion and overwhelming relief streaming down her face as she pressed kisses to their foreheads, whispering apologies and promises and love in an endless stream of words that couldn't fully express the emotions flooding her heart. Will everything really be okay now? Nyla asked, her voice small, but carrying a hope she'd been too afraid to feel before. Like speaking the question too loudly might shatter this fragile peace they'd fought so desperately to reach. Serena pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the solid reality of her presence. Yes, baby girl, we're together now. We're safe, and we're going to build a completely new life where fear doesn't control us anymore. Silas stood near the window, his eyes scanning the snow-covered forest one final time out of habit. But the tension had finally drained from his shoulders, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. He knelt beside Nyla, meeting her tired but determined eyes with respect that recognized the extraordinary courage she'd shown. "You were brave beyond your years tonight," he said softly, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "You protected your brother, faced down your worst fears, and never gave up even when giving up would have been so much easier. That courage matters more than you'll ever know." Nyla hugged Zion tighter, her small frame trembling slightly as the reality of their survival finally began to sink in beneath the layers of shock and adrenaline. "Thank you for keeping us safe, for being there when nobody else was. Thank you for reminding me why fighting for what's right matters," Silas replied. And in his eyes she saw the ghost of the daughter he'd lost, the redemption he'd been seeking, the purpose he'd finally rediscovered. Outside the cabin, the sun's reflection off pristine snow created a landscape that looked clean and new and full of infinite possibility, as if the world itself was offering them a fresh start. For the first time in longer than Nyla could measure, she allowed herself to imagine a future defined not by survival, but by actual living. School days filled with learning instead of fear, meals where they could eat without rationing every precious bite, quiet nights where Zion's cries meant he was teething rather than starving, moments where her mother could smile without that haunted look in her eyes. Serena, Silas, and Nyla shared a long glance filled with unspoken understanding, an invisible bond forming between three people who'd faced darkness together and somehow found their way to light. A new family had emerged from the ashes of trauma and chaos, not bound by blood alone, but by shared survival, by courage tested in fire, by the fierce determination to protect what mattered most. The terrible storm had finally passed completely, leaving behind clear skies and the kind of silence that spoke of peace rather than danger. But the lessons they'd learned, the love they'd discovered, and the courage they'd found would guide them through whatever came next, because they'd learned the most important truth of all, that hope isn't something you wait to receive, it's something you fight for with everything you have, something you build brick by brick even when the world tries to tear it down. And as Nyla held Zion close while watching golden sunlight paint the cabin walls, she remembered the promise that had started this entire journey, whispered it one more time with new understanding. "I will pay when I grow up. I swear." But now she understood that payment wasn't about money or debt. It was about carrying forward the kindness she'd received, about protecting others the way she'd been protected, about being the person who stands between danger and those who can't defend themselves. Their story wasn't over. It was just beginning, with chapters yet unwritten that would be filled with healing, growth, second chances, and the extraordinary power of choosing hope even when darkness seemed overwhelming. If you made it here, then it's a sign that you are destined for this. Subscribe to the channel now, so this won't be the last time you will come across stories like this. Thanks for watching.